Welcome to The Lead from New Lines magazine. I'm Danny Postel, the magazine's politics editor, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. And a very big event has been happening this week in Chicago, where I am. The Democratic Party has held its national convention here in my hometown. We're going to discuss the convention, the current state of the Democratic Party, divisions and cross-currents within it, protests against it, and what this all means for the November election, with two of my fellow Chicagoans, political scientist David Faris and sociologist Eman Abdelhadi. Political conventions are typically pretty formulaic affairs, some might say boring. But this convention has been orbited by drama. For the first time since 1968, when the Democratic Party also held its convention in Chicago, in what became a dramatic, indeed historic week, the sitting Democratic president pulled out of the race, and the vice president became the party's nominee. In a dizzyingly short period of time, Joe Biden stepping aside and Kamala Harris becoming the party's standard bearer has changed the equation of the 2024 election. Like 1968, there has also been drama outside the convention, on the streets of Chicago, where protesters have amassed from across the country to protest the Biden-Harris administration's stance on the Gaza war and Israel. What do these protests portend for the November election? Can Kamala Harris win over the nearly 500,000 people who voted uncommitted in the Democratic primaries, many of them in key swing states like Michigan? We'll explore these and other questions with Eman and David, scholars and writers who've given a lot of thought to these issues. Eman Abdelhadi is a sociologist who teaches in the Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago. She's at work on a book that explores how Muslim communities reproduce themselves across generations, using the case of second-generation immigrant Muslim Americans. David Faris teaches political science at Roosevelt University in Chicago. He writes frequently about American politics for Slate and Newsweek. His books include It's Time to Fight Dirty: How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics, and The Kids Are All Left: How Young Voters Will Unite America. Eman, David, welcome to The Lead.
Thank you so much for having us.
Great to be here, Danny.
So, David, I'd like to start with you as someone who's done a lot of thinking and writing about divisions within the Democratic Party between its progressive and more centrist wings, about generational politics and demographic trends. What's your sense of the mood of the convention and the overall political moment, if you will, as the party gathers its various tribes and unites behind the Harris-Waltz ticket?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a palpable enthusiasm, a kind of a cautious optimism that has swept over the party in the months since President Biden decided to step away from the race. And that's just due to, I think, a sense of relief among sort of rank and file Democrats that they would not have to go into this really critical election behind a candidate that I think a lot of people had lost trust and faith in, and who I think justifiably did not think that he really had enough left in the tank to run the kind of campaign that was necessary to win this election. And so that sense of enthusiasm can be seen and felt at the United Center. It can also be seen and felt, I think, in Democratic social circles, in polls, all of which point to a rejuvenated party that is much more enthusiastic about its nominee than it was just a month ago.
Eman, you're in a kind of interesting participant observer position with respect to the convention and the protests going on. Where are you at, if you will, on Kamala Harris as someone who voted uncommitted in the Illinois Democratic primary? This was, of course, before Joe Biden stepped down, and also as someone who's written extensively about the uncommitted movement. But first, before you answer that, give us a quick explainer for those unfamiliar as to what the uncommitted movement is
The uncommitted movement emerged out of Michigan during the Democratic presidential primaries, and it was a movement of voters who felt very disaffected by Biden's endless support for Israel's war in Gaza, and a sense that they were dissatisfied enough with the Democratic Party and with the Democratic incumbent that they were going to cast a sort of uncommitted vote. This is a repeat of what happened in 2008 before Obama became the Democratic nominee. There was a sort of move to vote uncommitted to signal dissatisfaction with the Democratic establishment. So these are Democratic voters who were dissatisfied. And so this started in Michigan and garnered 10% of voters, almost over 100,000 voters in Michigan voted uncommitted. And then it gained momentum across other states like Minnesota, Washington, Rhode Island. In Rhode Island, it actually got over 29% of the voters in the primary. So since then, the uncommitted movement has sort of coalesced, particularly around the demand for a ceasefire and the demand for a weapons embargo.
So approximately 500,000 people voted uncommitted in various states, including the key battleground state of Michigan, where you've spent a lot of time. You just wrote an article about Michigan that does a deep dive really into the genesis of the uncommitted movement, where it stands now. And Eman, how do you think that the uncommitted movement developed and got off the ground when Joe Biden was still the candidate? Now he's been replaced by Kamala Harris. How does that change the equation for uncommitted voters, some of whom are here as delegates, uncommitted delegates at the Democratic Convention, and some of whom are out on the streets protesting against the convention? Or there are different positions, right, within the uncommitted movement about what to do in November. Tell us about that, some of those different positions and where you stand personally.
Well, the uncommitted delegates have been clear that they are here to fulfill a function as Democrats, as part of the party. They're calling on Vice President Harris to unite the party around a popular demand of imposing some consequences on Israel, curbing its actions in Gaza. But so they've been emphasizing that they're not here as protesters primarily. Now, a lot of their allies and a lot of the energy behind the uncommitted movement has come from street protests over the last 10 months, as we've seen the sort of brutality unfolding in Gaza. And I think there's a lot of differences on the street about what needs to happen. There are folks who think that Kamala Harris has bloodied her hands too much by being a part of the Biden administration that has effectively funded and armed the killing of 40,000 Gazans, and that's the sort of lowest estimates. And there are others who feel optimistic about Harris's improvement in tone, that she's been more empathetic towards Palestinians, and that she picked Tim Walz, who's seen as also somewhat more sympathetic, as her running mate. So there's a shift, but I think what everyone sort of agrees on is that Harris has not actually lived up to the hopefulness of the moment, in that she hasn't offered any changes from Biden's policy on Gaza. Many feel that it was this policy, it was the sort of lack of red line around this war that sank Biden's election, right? He certainly lacked the mental acuity, but it's clear that his polling and his popularity dipped in large part because of the pro-Palestine movement. And so for her to continue his policies, the DNC posted the platform that they're voting on this weekend. And it's effectively the same exact policy that Biden has held. And so it feels like a cosmetic change. And I think many are saying that she has yet to earn their votes. That's how I feel as well. I'm a lifelong Democrat. I've been voting Democrat my entire life. I've canvassed for the party at various points, but this is a red line issue for me. And Harris has had the opportunity, has been told over and over what she needs to do to earn our votes, and she's refused to do so.
What could she do that would change that would encourage you, for example, to vote for her in November?
We've seen that Israel is going to use everything at its disposal to continue to ethnically cleanse Gaza. Members of Netanyahu's administration have been quite open in saying that that is their intent, and they've been quite open in enacting it. It's very clear that as Israel's main funder, as its main political ally and protector, if the U.S. continues to provide support without any red lines, which it has, then Israel is going to continue to use our tax dollars to kill women, largely women and children, to bomb schools, hospitals, infrastructure, homes. And so for us, we need to see that there are actually material consequences imposed on Israel. We need to see that there's an actual red line. I think a weapons embargo is fair. It's consistent with U.S. law. It is illegal to use to fund the killing of civilians. It is illegal to aid a government that is committing war crimes, and those have been extensively documented. And Harris needs to commit to following U.S. and international law by curbing U.S. aid to Israel.
Eman, how do you respond to those who argue that protesting against the DNC undermines Kamala Harris and could hurt her prospects?
You know, many of the supporters of this movement have a lot to lose at the prospect of a Trump presidency. We don't relish the idea of Trump as president. I remember having to call my mother, who works in rural mid-Missouri, every day after Trump got elected. And we saw that up until then, the largest wave of attacks against Muslims and Arabs in the U.S. You know, I remember having to call her every day and check on her to see if she made it home. It was a terrifying time. The fact that many of us are not quick to jump onto the Harris bandwagon should show just how desperate we are for the violence to end in Gaza. The reality is that the Harris administration needs to earn our votes. It is not fair or just to simply just offer that they're not the other guy, right? And the work of protesting, that is the work of politics, right? It is our job to pressure a candidate who is lobbying for our votes to actually meet our needs. We do not have the money of AIPAC, which is the Israel lobby, which pours millions and millions of dollars into defeating candidates like recently Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, who are critical of Israel. And so we have the street. The street is our arena to express this dissent. Kamala Harris can win these voters very quickly, can secure the election. We have seen over and over that she could earn more votes, lock down the progressive wing of this party that desperately wants to defeat Trump, but feels stuck. She could lock all of these votes down tomorrow if she announced a meaningful policy change on Gaza. The uncommitted movement has been saying that they would even canvass for her, that they would help get out the vote. But she's refusing to do so. And I think all Americans should be asking, why? Why is Israel worth risking this election? Why is Israel worth risking the possibility of Trump, the possibility of the demise of American democracy, the rise of fascism, in order to support this rogue, genocidal, far-right government? I think the burden is really on the people in power, not the people on the street who are protesting.
David, on that point, political scientists and historians have noted that even when a sitting vice president has views that diverge from the president, their boss, it's very, structurally speaking and historically speaking, it's very difficult for a sitting vice president to come out and break ranks with the sitting president while they're still in office, which is the case right now with Biden. Is your read on this that is simply the structural reality of where Kamala Harris is at right now, but that she's sending signals to activists that she does actually see it differently, she feels differently about the issue? She did actually ruffle the feathers of Benjamin Netanyahu when he was in Washington recently, and others on the Israeli right who denounced her. Or do you think that there's, as Eman is suggesting, is there some sense in which Kamala Harris really is just being overly cautious with this and very calculated?
Sure. I mean, it's a good question. I'm not sure that we have an answer to it. If you think back to the last year of reporting about this issue inside the White House, there's been like an endless stream of stories about Biden's private frustration with Netanyahu that never seems to get translated into a policy change, right? And in a lot of those stories, Harris was positioned as somebody that was also frustrated with the Biden administration's policy, but like obviously as vice president, you really can't come out and express a major policy disagreement like that, right? Like, we're in pretty uncharted territory in terms of what she can and can't do, because she is now the nominee, and she could conceivably break with the Biden administration's policy if she wanted to. But I do think that what's driving this is, and I don't agree with this, right? But like, what's driving this is a sense of caution, right? Because from the Harris team's perspective, right, if you look at where the race is right now, it looks like she's winning. It looks like swapping out the nominee fixed the problem. And if you drill down into crosstabs of polling, Harris has made a really sudden and remarkable recovery with young voters, folks under the age of 30, who are critical to any Democratic victory. And so I think from like a cold political calculus, she doesn't want the election to be about this. And it's a gamble, right? Because I think this issue has hurt Biden. I mean, there's no question that the Biden administration's policies vis-a-vis Gaza and vis-a-vis Israel have really diminished enthusiasm among young folks and among not just among young people, right? But a lot of people who are really sickened by what they see don't understand why the United States continues to show blind loyalty to this government in Israel and the really barbaric things that they're doing in Gaza. And so, we don't really know what's in Kamala Harris's heart about this, because there's not a policy record to speak of. She has not talked about it too much. As Eman noted, the Democratic platform has not much changed about it. And so if I was the Harris-Waltz team, I wouldn't expect a huge turnaround with folks for whom this is a key issue if they don't make a change, right? And the real question from a political standpoint, right, is whether that gamble is going to pay off, right? Are the people who would come around and vote for this ticket, if there was a policy change, will they be decisive or not in swing states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Arizona? We don't know the answer to that question, right? But given what we've seen so far, the gamble seems to be that they think that that having a new nominee who's not Joe Biden is sufficient to turn around their fortunes and to be able to win this thing. And maybe the theory is like, well, after she gets into power, then there could be a pivot. All I'll say is I went to college in the mid 90s, right? And like, I've been waiting like my entire life for American policy vis-a-vis Israel and the Palestinians to change. And I'll believe it when I see it.
I think that's exactly right. I think the progressive wing of the party, but especially, folks for whom this issue is a key issue, have no reason to trust that things are going to pivot after this election. I mean, it would take us literally believing that they're somehow going to become more left-wing on their policy, on their stated policy, which I don't think has happened on any policy. I'm not sure I can think of any policy in which, after getting elected, the Democrats decided to take a more left-wing stance. And I want to emphasize how this is landing for a lot of us, right, that have literally been watching this death and destruction happen on our phones every single day for almost 11 months now, actually, to then be told, to then be sort of massively bullied. If you're critical of Kamala right now, in social media, right, you're going to get harassed and told you're a Trump supporter and that you support Project 2025 and all of these offensive accusations, and to be told, wait for things to change, even though they never have after the election. So I think that what's happening is that Harris, this calculus, this gamble might make sense for this election, but I think that the Democrats are continuing to, in the long run, erode their trust among young people who, might be willing to kind of make this short-term sacrifice and just hold their nose and vote for Harris because they don't want Trump. But ultimately, does this build the party in the long run, right? Does this actually bring us all together? I think there is a generation of definitely Arab and Muslim Americans that were raised in the progressive coalition in the post 9/11 era of seeing the Republicans as the kind of enemy, who now don't trust either party, there's a generation that this party is losing, but could secure, right? The fastest growing county in a swing state is a Yemeni majority county in Michigan. That's a generation that the Democrats could secure for decades if they change their policy on this. And so I think for all of us, we have to ask, why not, right? And I think that comes down to how our political system is working, and these kind of bigger fundamental structural changes we need to make.
David, a few minutes ago, Eman mentioned the threat that Trump poses both to Arab and Muslim communities and migrants and people of color, but more broadly to democracy. And immediately after the assassination attempt on Trump, which was just last month, a lot of conservatives, J.D. Vance most prominently, blamed Democrats for inflating the stakes of the election and saying that democracy itself is on the line, which these conservatives argued was a dangerous exaggeration that fostered a climate of violence. You wrote in your book, It's Time to Fight Dirty, all the way back in 2018, about the anti-democratic menace of Trumpism. So my question to you is that given his turn toward a more explicitly authoritarian agenda this time around, I mean, he's been leaning into the anti-democratic motif, flirting with being a dictator on day one, threatening to invoke the Insurrection Act and unleash the military on protesters, to conduct an unprecedented roundup and deportation of migrants. Given this, I take it you would stand by that warning from 2018 about the threat Trump poses to democracy. But interestingly, the Democratic Party has now pivoted away from that theme. Biden emphasized it, but it seems that the threat of democracy message kind of failed to catch on with voters, and it's pretty much absent from Kamala Harris's messaging. The campaign has opted instead for the argument that Trump and Vance are weird and creepy, that their views on gender and culture war issues are outside of the mainstream. This is, in fact, what catapulted Tim Waltz to the top of the VP list and why he was ultimately picked. That's how momentous this theme is. So what do you make of this pivot, David? You recently wrote a piece warning Democrats about going too far with this weird argument.
Sure. I mean, I think that the move away from the existential democracy stuff was actually overdue, not because it's not true. Like, I do think that Donald Trump and his movement pose a really significant threat to the ongoing existence of, like, what's left of American liberal democracy, but it wasn't working, right? Like, I think that voters have, a kind of a justifiable sense of democracy rescue fatigue. This is the third consecutive national presidential election in which voters are being told that the stakes of the election are existential. If we lose, everything ends. And I think that in a lot of ways, they could look back at recent history and say, like, maybe not all of these warnings were necessarily prescient, or maybe we haven't gotten there yet. But I think the point is that voters, I think, are tired of being told that the motivation for their decision should be to save democracy rather than to see any other sort of, like, positive, forward-looking policy changes that I think particularly a lot of people on the left are looking for. And so I think the decision to stop talking about democracy, like, it's not like she never talks about it, right? But, like, this set of, like, lines that Biden has been trotting out for years now about how we're at an inflection point and, like, this election will chart the path of the next 30 years, it just wasn't getting through, and so I think that the Harris-Walz campaign made a very savvy decision to switch the messaging to a different set of issues and try to put democracy and January 6th and all that stuff on the back burner. And they've instead chosen to highlight the extremism of the MAGA movement. I think that's also the right strategic move. I'm just worried that, like, calling J.D. Vance weird, which he, like, absolutely is extremely weird, could like bleed into a way of talking about, like, ordinary people who might be considering voting for Trump, Vance, and, like, talking about their culture and their norms, which, like, I don't share, but I think you can be like, it's weird to want everyone to stay home with their children without saying that it's weird for anyone to want to stay home with their children. Does that make sense? So there's a way of, like, positioning their policy proposals as well outside of the mainstream without looking at the basic sort of cultural underpinnings of the MAGA movement with condescension.
Weird seems like a repeat of the deplorables comment that Hillary Clinton made, which was not a winning strategy.
Right. And David actually invoked that specter in his piece. But to be fair, I think what Tim Waltz was arguing is not that everyone who votes for Trump or Vance is weird, but that they themselves, that their obsession, Vance in particular, his obsession with these culture war arguments, these sort of the natalism and nativism of this obsession with gender roles and population and cat ladies, the childless cat ladies comment. Like, I think Waltz is trying to say, like, what would motivate someone to be so worked up about whether people decide to have children or not? Like, that's just weird. And I think that's why it resonated. I think Waltz, if you listen to that long interview he gave to Ezra Klein shortly before he was tapped by Kamala Harris as her pick, he makes it really clear that actually he thinks it's very dangerous to talk about people who vote for Trump, many of whom are in his own family. Like, he knows these people, right? He grew up in a small town in Nebraska. He represented, for about a decade, he represented a congressional district in southern Minnesota that interestingly voted twice for Trump, but voted for him. So he has this crossover appeal that very few Democrats do in this hyper-polarized age that we live in. So I just wanted to say, for the record, I totally agree with your warnings, both of you, about the potential danger of leaking into this deplorables thing. But I think it's actually a quite different argument that he's making from the more damaging one that Hillary Clinton made.
No, I agree. I mean, I don't. The messaging that I'm hearing from Waltz is not like disturbing to me, right? And I think that he's a great contrast with the kind of candidate that we've come to expect in our national politics, which is like an Ivy League law school to like clerkship to prosecutor to attorney general to politician pipeline.
Not that you're talking about Josh Shapiro by any chance.
I'm not going to name names. Right.
Yeah. That just happens to resemble a certain governor from Pennsylvania who was also on the short list.
But I feel like having like somebody with a more like regular person background in this kind of position is a really cool maneuver, and I think will be really helpful to the Democratic Party as it seeks to win over groups of voters that they've lost over the last 20 or 25 years, as the party has come to be associated more with like a college-educated elite, at least among white voters, right? So I think the picking Waltz was a pretty brilliant maneuver, right? I think that highlighting the strangeness, the extremism of the Trump-Vance tickets, not just their policy positions, but like I'm convinced that somebody has a treasure trove of JD Vance's podcast appearances over the last the last 5 years, and they're just like strategically releasing one outrageous thing at a time. You know, like last week it was how the entire purpose of the postmenopausal female was to raise their grandchildren. It's like, you couldn't sit down with a group of people and come up with a series of more damaging interview transcripts than JD Vance has already done, and there's nothing you can do about it, right? It's out there in the public domain. So I think that they should and they will continue to run with that. I was more sort of sounding a note of caution to not slip into that mode of like condescension to people, right? Which people really don't respond to. That also applies to people that you're trying to convince to vote for the Harris-Waltz ticket, right? Like this like widespread vote shaming, like, oh, you're just, you're helping to elect Trump. This stuff doesn't work. And I will also caution people on the left not to use those tactics with people that they're trying to convince, right? Like people respond to like kind of one-on-one persuasion much more than they do people like popping off on social media about how you're like engaging in destructive behavior for like using your right to protest.
Yeah, speaking of vote shaming and popping off on social media, that's my next question for you, Eman. In her Washington Post column, Karen Attia recently wrote, "Viral TikToks, tweets, and videos are driving wedges between Black people and Palestinians. Black people excited and energized by Harris's entry into the race are being accused of selling out over identity politics. On the other hand, Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims who refuse to support Harris are being accused of anti-Blackness." So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this, Eman, as an Arab and Muslim woman who has, in your own words, done a lot of organizing in solidarity with Black liberation struggles.
Yeah, I think it's a shame to see, and I think there's two things to recognize. One is that the social media that we use is not a free platform. It's not like this kind of public forum in which everything is a democratic exchange. I think that we've seen that certain party lines get amplified, and so I think that there's a purposeful sowing of discord that's happening online, and a lot of people have pointed to that, and that's been a consistent strategy, for decades of the ruling class, of like sowing discord between different minority communities that are usually in alliance. But I think that perhaps a bigger part of it is that I think people are desperate to feel some joy and excitement in this moment. And I think that there's a very real and fair dissatisfaction with the amount of solidarity that non-Black people of color have shown to the Black community, and a reaction to the very real anti-Blackness that exists in the Arab community along with other non-Black communities. And so I think that there's a lot that's surfacing right now in this moment. And I think it's important to sort of broaden our analysis to think about, one, how the solidarities that do exist are not highlighted and are not narrativized, right? Everyone I know was on the streets in 2020, and before that was on the streets all the way back to when Trayvon Martin was murdered. But that narrative of solidarity, I mean, there's this way that we speak about social movements in this deeply siloed ways, right? That only these people are protesting. And in fact, the Palestine Solidarity Movement is a great example of that, right? There's a narrative that says, oh, it's the Palestinians, it's the Arabs, it's the Muslims. When in reality, if you've been to any of these marches, we're actually usually a minority at these marches. They are so multiracial. And that was the case for the movement for Black Lives, where it was so multiracial and so coalitional. But the way that it's narrativized undermines the amount of solidarity that happens. And so I think there's a lot of things going on there, but I think there's also a sense of desperation that American democracy hasn't been working for Black folks and for people of color more broadly, that there's this sense that we keep not winning anything. And so there's a latching on to kind of the symbolic and representational dimensions, because I think people are really hungry for that feeling of winning something, for that feeling of being excited. And it's not fun to be on the on the other side of that. So I think, kind of like what David was saying earlier, we need to be strategic about messaging and how we frame these things. Some of the responses I got on social media were extremely like just violent, saying that, I should be jailed for protesting or deported. But
deported? You were born in Missouri.
I was born in Missouri. Trust me, I do not want to be deported back to Missouri. That's one of the worst fates I can imagine. So some of that, but some of the exchanges were actually, I think, very productive, where people were saying, listen, I need to be pragmatic. We need to recognize that the Black community has a lot to lose from a Trump presidency. The Arab community does too, and the Muslim community does too. But I think that especially on the far left, if we present ourselves as people who, as people who are not concerned with the kind of material reality of working people of color, that somebody might lose their food stamp benefits. I spoke to progressive organizers in Detroit who say that some of the wins that they've received in terms of money for housing, money for education, they depend on federal money. That money could disappear overnight if Trump is elected. We need to be attuned to that reality and think about our strategy in the long term.
I mean, I think if we can step back and look at the bigger picture here, I know it's hard because there's a crisis right now, right? And people are being slaughtered, right? And so like me talking about like, look at the long-term trends in polling. I'm not trying to dismiss the very real need for policy change right now, but there has been a lot of success in this movement. Okay, this activism has been very effective in changing minds over the last 20 years. For the first time, a plurality of Democrats sympathizes more with the Palestinians than with the Israelis in the gold standard Gallup polling. It is a record high number of overall Americans who sympathize with the Palestinians. There's still a lot of work to do, but there has been a tectonic shift inside the Democratic Party away from blind support for Israel and toward a more humane understanding of the conflict and like seeing Palestinians as like human beings, just as deserving of rights and dignity as Israelis are. So that's a huge accomplishment, I think, for the Palestinian movement overall. It's just that it's still falling just short of making that kind of change inside the Democratic Party, and particularly at the very top of the Democratic Party. And so I think like there's no reason that activists cannot simultaneously show support for Palestinian rights and also try to show solidarity with the first Black woman to run for president, right? Like, I don't think that these things are necessarily in tension with one another as much as there are simply unresolved tensions within the coalition about these policies. And so in that sense, I completely agree with you, man. Like, this is part of politics, right? Like the way that you get policy change is you get the activists together, you protest, you persuade, you try to get into the rooms where decisions are made and change people's minds. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with showing up to the DNC and protesting, right? Like I think there's a hope that things don't get out of hand, but like the act of protesting, the act of being like, we're protesting you because you're the only ones that we think will actually do anything about it, right? Like that's why you're protesting Democrats instead of Republicans, because there's no point in showing up to the RNC and protesting about this, because we know how awful the Republican Party is. It's much worse than the Democrats even. So, and the Democrats have been pretty bad. So that's a high bar to clear.
You've both done a lot of thinking and writing about generational politics. David, your book, The Kids Are All Left, How Young Voters Will Unite America, makes the case that generational and demographic factors are becoming increasingly pivotal for American politics and spell disaster for the Republicans long term. Eman, your book In Progress examines second-generation immigrant Muslim Americans, and in an essay you wrote a few months ago for the magazine In These Times, you explore, as the title puts it, how U.S. Muslims have transformed in the 20 years since 9/11 and what it means in the wake of 10/7, October 7th. So I'd like to hear from both of you about the role of generational dynamics in this election. Let me start with you, David. So while it's true that young voters are trending more and more progressive, as you detail in your book, there's a gender and racial divide here, right? Young men, especially white men under 30, are increasingly alienated from the Democrats and could throw the election to Trump. What do you make of this?
Sure. I mean, one thing is I think that we should be careful not to read too much into like subgroup crosstabs of polls prior to the elections, right? What we've seen actually several cycles in a row is pre-election polling showing Republicans making big gains with black voters, for instance, or young voters, and then those gains not actually materializing on election day. I think the numbers that we've seen in 2022 and 2020 and 2018 are broadly similar to patterns throughout the 21st century. And I would also say, like, yes, like young white men under 30 are not as progressive as, you know, as other subgroups under the age of 30, but they are also significantly more progressive than white men over the age of 30. Right. So that these things tend to move in tandem. Like if you look at voters under 30 as a whole, as a cohort, they are the most progressive generation that we have ever seen. And the problem for Republicans is that this has not actually always been the case, right? The misconception is that the young voters have always been stalwart Democrats, right? And that's not the case, right? Young voters went for Reagan in 1980. They went for Nixon in 72. And so this 20-year pattern of young people voting disproportionately for Democrats is now reaching people like my age, right? I'm in my mid-40s. And functionally, everybody under the age of 45 now tends to vote disproportionately Democrat when it comes to election time. And what we had seen over the past year is some worrying signs that Democrats were actually losing a lot of ground with these groups. The war in Gaza is certainly one of those factors. I think just a broader fatigue with like gerontocracy in general was also driving that. Like, I mean, I can just tell you from spending many, many hours in classrooms with young folks at Roosevelt, people are just tired of being governed by elderly people, right? Like they just feel like they just don't get it. And I think that they have very good reason to think that older folks don't get it, right? The swapping out of Biden for Harris has made up some of that ground. It hasn't made up all of that ground with young voters, right? The margins are still showing a little bit less than they were in 2020. With young folks, and I completely agree with you, man. Like the way that you could get those voters is to offer concrete policy change to stop the killing, right? The arms embargoes, making a real play for a ceasefire. I think there's good reasons for them not to want to get into like the details of the ultimate disposition of the conflict, right? But a message of like what is happening is wrong, and I will do something about it. I think that would really resonate with young folks who are, again, like disproportionately sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. And even if you look at like young white men under 30, they're more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause than white dudes over the age of 65. So you're seeing that change under the hood, even with young white men. It's not reaching to the same level, if that makes sense.
You know, I also think that for people of color, right, for younger generations of people of color, I think there's this feeling of being bullied into the Democratic Party. And I think we're seeing that in this online discourse, this sense that like, we don't care about you. You have to come along anyway because the other people hate you, right? And I think they're underestimating the degree to which, especially for second generation immigrants' children that have grown up in this country, that doesn't really resonate. There's this sense that we also have a right to be wooed as voters, right? We have a right to be treated like other voters, where you're concerned about our concerns, where you actually make an effort with us, not just assume that we're going to jump on the bandwagon. So I think that's part of what's coming to surface here in this election, and that Gaza has made really, really clear. So I think the generational question, and then I think as a demographer, I think about which communities are growing in this country, and I think about the long-term potential for this party. These are long-term investments as well in these communities, and that's, the Democrats are not thinking long-term on this, it seems.
As Democrats think about how to do persuasion over the next few months, if they can't bring themselves to do actual policy change, I think that a message of like the other guy is worse is not a winning message, to particularly to young Muslim American or Palestinian American voters. There's a scene in Monty Python's The Life of Brian where someone is about to be executed for heresy, and then he starts mouthing off to a Roman centurion who says, "You're only making it worse for yourself." And the guy's like, how could it be any worse, right? Like, I think if you're a Palestinian or you're somebody that sympathizes deeply with this cause, it's like, explain to me how this could be worse, right? And so I think that Harris will have to find a message that can walk that line, that can offer policy change, that doesn't vote shame, and that doesn't position the threat of Donald Trump as like the only reason to support her. Okay, that's not going to move the needle. Maybe she can win without doing that. I don't know, right? But like, I think that's not going to move the needle with people who are highly motivated by this particular issue.
Eman, David, thank you both for joining us on The Lead.
Thanks so much for having us, Danny.
Yeah, thank you. It was great to be here.
This has been The Lead, a podcast from New Lines Magazine. You can find Eman Abdelhadi on X at Eman, E-M-A-N, Abdelhadi, and David Faris at David M. Faris with one R. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Danny Postel. For more episodes like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.